Internacional del Libro de Guadalajara presenta.
Buenos días, tengan todos ustedes. La Feria Internacional del Libro de Guadalajara.
The Guadalajara International Book Fair has organized for 18 years now the Reading Promoting Encounter. This meeting is a special edition with which we will have our 18 years of age being accomplished, so that now we are in a legal age, and we will be celebrating an anniversary, an additional anniversary of the International Book Fair. This meeting tries to find a way to capitalize nationally and internationally support connecting reading promoters so that their professionalization and recognition of the mediator can be the essential link between books and readers. This year, through this screen, I would like to send a very warm greeting to all the reading promoters and readers, all readers. My greetings go to you. This year round, we have this special edition, and we have the Reading Brain, the title of this year's presentations, and we will have presenters, we will have writers who will talk about the cognitive aspects of reading and how they can have an instance on the reader's brains, regardless of their ages. We are now going to introduce our guest of honor, Marina Colasanti. She's a writer, a plastic artist, journalist, publicist, and illustrator. Ms. Colasanti has been widely recognized for her literary quality that is expressed in poetic, enriched language and the elegy of fantasy, as well as the use and mastery of symbolism, as well as the fairy tales value in the reading and rereading of her works, as well as the construction of very profound characters, well consolidated in an interior world. She has, for example, short stories, poetry, chronicles, essays, and productions in prose, and those are above 70 published books in Brazil and worldwide. And she has been an illustrator as well as part of her multifaceted talent. Some of her books in Spanish, and I truly recognize the fact of the relevance of reading them. We have the young trainer, we have the friendship moves the tale, 23 stories of a travel woman, Penelope sends her regards, the rainbow girl, the labyrinth of the wind, and the man that never stopped growing. Without further ado, we would like to welcome Marina. Thank you, Marina, for being here. Well, thank you for the generosity of this introduction, and thank you for allowing me to be here today. I would like to thank you. And kisses and hugs. We only have 45 minutes to talk during this presentation, so let's move to it. The word we will be talking about is link. Link is the word with which we will start our conversation. We are so used to talking about links only when we relate them to technology's information, and we forget that information technology was born as an imitation, still primitive, of the human brain. In the early 60s, I am a very old woman. I worked as a reporter for IBM's internal magazine. Computers, which were huge cabinets back then, were called electronic brains. And they advised me not to name them that way, given that users feared that machines were going to replace them. The fear still persists, as we've seen in so many dystopian future movies in which humans are attacked by robots. But the name changed. Now we call thinking machines artificial intelligence. I now return to the initial word, link. A link is exactly what our brain does when we read. Every single function activates a certain area of the brain, while in parallel, what we read awakens our emotions. Now, when we decode letters, words, and phrases, we activate large areas of the cerebral cortex. Memory, which is stimulated by what is being read, activates the hippocampus. The recognition of the meaning of words activates the occipital and temporal cortex. Reasoning about content requires the collaboration of the prefrontal cortex. And narratives and sentimental content start the amygdala to work. By that I mean that reading is equivalent to a complete gym class for the brain. It's a brain gym class. It can last more than an hour and it can be repeated more times during any single day. For example, in my case, I spend about an hour and a half to read the newspapers. And I create furious links between stories that relate to news cited the different countries of the world, and this is an effort to understand what's happening worldwide. Now, during the rest of the morning, I complete my task as a writer. And in the afternoon, I can do some research or write. And eventually, during this pandemic, I do lives or live sessions, such as this that we are currently having. And before dinner time, and I wait for the food to be ready, whether it's in the oven or on the stove, I start reading a book that might have been left on the table. And I anticipate that, of course, before my meals. So, one way or another, I spend my days carefully studying the written words or talking about them. Reading, even if it's not just literature we're talking about, takes up most of my time. And it's not exactly a choice. Of course, it was a choice at first. It is now a professional requirement, the same that has been imposed on teachers, researchers, and so many activities that we could relate to. The ability to read is not born with us. It is not in our genetic code, such as movement or voice emission. It must be transmitted, taught, and above all, practiced. It's like walking. Of course, we need to grow and learn how to walk repeatedly, and we have to mediate the process. I come to think of the wolf children that were found in India in 1911. They didn't know how to speak and only walked on all fours. One of them, Sani Shar, never managed to speak, but the other, who died at the age of 6, had accumulated a vocabulary of 100 words. That would be enough to understand the wolf children and remember Mowgli. That would relate us to Mowgli immediately, the wild child created by Kipling in the Jungle Book, who inhabited my imaginary childhood. Literacy alone does not suffice. Functionally illiterates, that is, people who can read but cannot decode, therefore do not know what they have just read, abound worldwide. A good reader, such as the case of a good athlete, needs training, exercise, and the willingness to improve. Reading a book and not understanding half of it, and then taking another book, knowing that what was left of the previous one was the most important one, not the one that was left in the vacuum. The parts that we understand, the sections that we actually understand. Literature reading, above all, is cumulative, given that each book provides knowledge that will add to the reading of the next book and enrich it even further, or even modify it. Successful readers have an extensive repertoire that allows them to move fluently through any literary work. I just found out that very recently I hired a guy. He was in his 30s to do some errands in my in my workplace, which is my home. As soon as he walked in, he was very interested in the shelf stacked with double row books. I am married to a poet, a literature teacher, and the sum of these two has meant that our house has shelves in every room and piles of books everywhere. So after a few days and getting used to the domestic environment, this boy asked me to lend him a book. I was careful, thinking that probably he was not used to literature. I specifically chose some stories by Hemingway. There's no way he doesn't like Hemingway, I thought. Now, it took him a while to finish the book. 1 week later, he asked me for another book. I gave him the biography of a specifically interesting author. I don't think he finished it. However, he might have. He did not talk about either book. He never mentioned a word, and he never borrowed books from me ever again. Almost a year later, I saw him reading with great interest. It was a almost psychology theme, specifically self-help. He had not connected, he had not linked to the books I had lent him. Not because he was not interested, because of course he asked for the books, but the situation was the lack of reading repertoire. He was not used to reading literature. So there was no way for him to make a link between Hemingway and his historical moment, his journalistic style, his role in world literature, his participation in the war in Spain, or his cigars while in Cuba, or his very own suicide with a hunting gun. He was a great hunter. Now, all those small pieces of knowledge would have contributed, in turn, to provide more flavor into the reading, an individual, peculiar flavor. The same phenomenon happened with a slightly older girl. She was delighted by the never-before-seen quantity of books, and she asked me to lend her one. I chose something light, a love story, although I knew that light for me could be an overwhelming mountain for her. She didn't go even beyond the first pages. She explained what she wanted, and I thought she wanted some pink novels, those that can be bought in newsstands, those that do not inhabit in my shelves. She said she loved reading, but I never noticed any book in her backpack, and I never saw her reading any book whatsoever. Now, the reading brain has to be trained gradually, step by step, since childhood. And this training background depends on the mediator. A good mediator is a coach. He or she acts as a coach, selecting the readings according to the progress of the reader, and always taking care of proper balance so as not to divert them from reading. And instead of that, seducing them, luring them through the introduction to more and more books. In Brazil, the most relevant mediator is the elementary school professor. We're talking about female teachers most of the time, given that most parents were never trained or literate enough to close the reading gap. And most of the households in Brazil do not have books to offer children. Therefore, the teacher's task should not be limited to teaching reading and comprehension of what is being read, as normally happens. And more importantly, is to create proper conditions so that students can be interested in reading by expanding their training and always making it available for them to have books that correspond to their interests. Another very important mediator could be the librarian, who chooses the book according to their knowledge of the young reader. Now, that only happens in schools with a library or a reading room and a very competent librarian. It's not that common as it should be. Well, even so, at school you read much less than necessary and never, ever for pleasure. It's never leisure reading. Reading, henceforth, is generally conceived as a literacy tool, an instrument, if I may, to pass exams. And when you have instrumentalized reading, transformed into a duty and obligation, started with questions to test comprehension, runs a very serious risk of becoming something that could be overwhelming. Very few young people continue to read after they have completed their school years. And as I always say when I talk to teachers that don't read, or those that apologize for not reading or having it as a habit, will not make one of their many students to read. Reading literature is transmitted by loving, caring osmosis through passion from one vein to another as an artistic transfusion. Thanks to literature, I learned definite things that, without any doubt, changed the way I see my origin and the way I read life. Let me tell you how this happened. This was not out of chance that I was born in Africa. My father had volunteered twice in the Italian colonial wars, called Wars of Conquest by Fascism. The second time, he even demoted his ranking position, given that there were so many officers. He had already gotten married, so he went to the war as a private. He fell in love with Africa. He fell in love with life in the colonies and asked for his change, to move there. That's how he and my mother, who was already pregnant, saw me being born in Asmara. That's the capital of Eritrea, a small country between Ethiopia and Sudan. At home, I always heard about the benefits that civilization could bring around when colonization would relate to these benefits. For example, the building of roads and cities, the establishment of railways, the money invested and not money earned. They always told me about hunting and the parties at the governor's mansion, life in the colony that was presented to me as a glamorous one, only glamour. They never told me, however, that Italians were forbidden to marry natives and that they could not recognize their children with these natives, and whenever an Italian walked by the sidewalk, the African had to step away. But the oppression of colonialism was transmitted to me through books. Sandokan is a heroic pirate of royal origin, a character from books by Italian author Emilio Salgari. He is heroic because, having been forced to witness the murder of his family during the English invasion of his empire, he swore revenge and only attacked the ships of the British Empire or the East India Companies Known as the Malaysian tiger, he became the terror of those who sail the seas of Borneos. Now, having read all 11 books between the ages of 6 and 8, gave me a different idea about colonization. And it definitely put me on the side of the oppressed. Reading gave me a different view sight as opposed to the one I heard from my family. And more curiously is the fact that sponsors were my own parents when they bought Salgari books for my brother and I. This is kind of like a message. They were somehow telling me, although that was not their intention, that there was always more than one viewpoint for any matter, for any question out there. 2 years later, we moved to Rio de Janeiro. I was about to turn 20 when my father gave me a book by Paul Éluard, a French surrealist poet. By then, I had no idea what surrealism was or that Éluard was a poetic exponent of the movement. As a matter of fact, I didn't understand much of what I read, nor would it have been possible. The book, Une leçon de morale, a moral lesson, had a profound impact on me. As a matter of fact, I memorized several poems so that I could repeat them mentally whenever I was riding the bus to the university. Every poem in the book had two versions, one for the good and one for the evil. Au bien, au mal, led me to incorporate myself to what I once had as an infantile sensation, and that is the plurality of views on every single situation that might arise. We know, thanks to statistics of the publishing world, that women read more novels and poetry and buy more books to give away. This is the ideal gift by women. Men, on the other hand, prefer to read technical books related to their profession or essays. We could then believe that it is not a randomized choice, but rather by the use of the brain of each gender. And then we have to go back to the word link, the one with which we started this conversation. In men, the left cerebral hemisphere is the one that dominates the scene. Women, however, move indifferently between both hemispheres. In men, for instance, information is separated into segmented groups, not necessarily related. In women, the information is interlaced, interconnected, like a single system. Men mainly use their view sight to assimilate and understand the world. Women use all senses, all sensory, for example, sight, touch, smell, and hearing, which together operate with equal importance. This scenario leads men to excel in logic, mathematics, spatial location, mechanical activities, as well as gross motor skills. Women excel in language, performing arts, fine motor skills, perception of feelings, and multitasking that can be carried out simultaneously. Now, please take me away from the concept of limiting everything to brain function. We understand that this meeting is titled The Reading Brain, but please take me away from that concept. We now know that the social factor acts from early childhood, or even more certainly from birth, to encase new individuals in their pre-established models. And many centuries have passed by, way too many centuries, time during which the society has established for women the role of affection distributor, if you will, as well as the universal refuge and unlimited understanding. However, it's not worth to attribute everything to the social factor. Researching for this conference, which is something I do at home, I was able to find only one professional opinion that denies the difference in brain use based on gender. Gina Rippon, British neuroscientist and feminist, in her book The Gendered Brain, says that there's no valid scientific evidence for any brain difference between men and women. Likewise, she states that behavioral differences should be exclusively attributed to the social factor. This could be a feminist attitude, not scientifically based, refuting women the restricted role the society has imposed on them. We are determined to change that predetermination. On the other hand, I found the report of a very interesting piece of investigation that involved 118 human fetuses of both sexes, still in the womb, published in the article titled Sexual Differences in Functional Connectivity During the Development of the Fetal Brain, published by Elsevier, one of the most important publishers when it comes to medical contents. Researchers used advanced MRI technology to research neurological connections of fetuses. That is, links. They try to find links and found connections between parts of the female brain that were almost non-existent in the male brain. However, it is unclear to neuroscientists what these sexual differences mean when it comes to the actual brain function and how brain activity is related to emotions and human experiences. Scientists do not have a clear view that, of course, need to scientifically prove everything they claim. But for us, those that live from observation, now understand that women might watch more soap operas because of the senses that arouse more intimacy with human feeling, and that they might read more poetry because they are more akin to histrionics, that is, to metaphor, to what is said without being said, whose meaning must be captured behind the words or behind the scenes. We believe that's only fair that when having more ease with the language, they can be delighted by novels and not only focused on professional readings. It also seems natural to give this away as gifts, given that they give more gifts than men, And because knowledge is not, in the case of most women, a power tool to keep for themselves, but rather a good to be shared with others. It has been proven that girls learn how to read and write at early stages and more easily than boys. But this is not only because of why they are educated, but because there is to flow indistinctively between both cerebral hemispheres and the interweaving of information. And given that reading teaches how to write, we have a snake that would be biting its own tail. One activity will feed on the other, and both will complement each other. I am being told that we have a couple more minutes to finish this talk. After 11 years, I carried out psychoanalysis. So I started 11 years, this sector that was for my generation, almost part of the curriculum. We all did it. But out of those 11 years, seven were in a group that actually stayed the same way for a long time. For me, it was a great learning experience, which I later used for almost 20 years as a behavioral editor for a high circulation women's mainstream magazine. Reading a novel is like participating in a discussion group. If, for example, we have different characters as well as different people in a group, in any given group, and characters interact with one another by intertwining their lives, their feelings, just as an analysis or a discussion group would do in their weekly meetings, for example. Each attitude or action of all the characters will be received in a different way by the other components of the novel. The difference when it comes to the reactions will correspond to the personality of each character, which the narrator builds progressively as if a path were paved and a very fine thread, metaphorically speaking, for each of them. The same is true in a group analysis. We can be more talkative, for example, and most withdrawn to the topic, but at the end of the day, both follow the same rules. And this manifestation can occur through a narration, some event that might have happened to that specific person, or because of the interpretation or reaction of another participant. The whole group will benefit from following this dynamic, given that verbalized feelings acquire visibility and body as the game founder discovered. That would be Sigmund Freud. We have many narrators. It could be a number of narrators. It could be the omniscient narrator, but they see things from different points and standing. Now we have the character narrator that would be more leveraged on the story, but I prefer the omniscient narrator, maybe because I want to see things from above. The omniscient narrator knows what goes on in the soul of each character. At the same time that he traces his image and his speech, he opens up, as if he were a surgeon, the chest, of the creature, in this case the book, so that the reader can become aware of the secret worlds that he only enunciates for himself. And same thing happens to every single character. This, in turn, would give us a kaleidoscope of feelings in which pieces change places and light up every time we turn the page. We read both inside and outside of each other, and little by little, we acquire the ability to understand the actions and reactions that occur, not only within the novel, but rather in life. In an analytic group, the analyst can be, partially at least, the role of the omniscient narrator. Why do I say partially? Because despite the fact that he or she might not know or think that they know more about each participant, should not reveal most of what they know. Analysts use their knowledge to lead the conversation, to provoke, to invite to the conversation all those that, because of shyness or defense, remain silent. And when appropriate, there's interpretations that are led by the analyst, like analysis, reading a good novel can have a direct dialogue with the unconscious, identification and empathy with characters and situations set forward the connection. And once the connection is established, questions can be asked and answers can be sought after. But it's not only feelings that a good novel is all about. We have characters with their feelings, with their very own feelings, are in the midst of a historical moment, and they are part of a geography and a culture. They speak a certain language dictated by their circumstances, and these circumstances always fall behind a good novel, and characters are used by the author precisely to talk about the circumstances in which they move, or circumstances that move them. And I would like you to please pay close attention to these differences, subtle but relevant. Perhaps this is the reason of the international success of Pinocchio. That is, the intuition that characters are puppets whose strings are pulled by the author. But the true intention is to talk about the world as it is and how it could be. In Collodi's case, he was interested in talking about poverty that marked his childhood, the Tuscany region where he grew up, magic that inhabited his imagination, the greed and cunning of some, and the always likely redemption. Reading literature seems to open a third eye on the reader's forehead. The reading eye. Those who read literature broaden their horizons, come into contact with other realities, renew their way of thinking, while those who do not read are limited to orality, to dialogue with friends or colleagues who generally think in unison. But beware, I will never despise orality. What a pleasure when the elders passed on stories from the past to young people and to children. Their narratives were spoken novels which could last for days and always welcomed by attentive eyes. And the narratives of the elders ended up changing in the memory of the young, becoming other narratives in a long, long chain that connected the present and the past. and fed the imagination. From narrative to narrative, we became more human, and narratives could be, as an example, the Rupestrian paintings in France and in Altamira, Spain. And this could be graphic narratives, but they very well explain hunting and tools that were used for different activities. Many centuries passed by during the Bronze Age that would give rise to clay tablets, papyrus scrolls, and later on books. The indigenous Brazilians did not have writing, but they were rich in narratives. And many of them related to the genesis of their ethnic groups, others with their deities and gods, and many more, humanizing the animals in the jungle, rainforest. Fortunately, all these stories were compiled by the indigenists. In fact, I found a Chinese Cinderella version brought by Portuguese colonizers without any doubt, or missionary priests, later adapted to the experience of the Tene Tejaras Indians. These narratives are indispensable for human beings. They work to balance life and to live within its mystery and accept its finitude. And it's through narratives that we can convey the message when we read, and then we can perpetuate it. Famous fishermen stories, even when praising the author, are stories in which the fisherman describes his universe, what inhabits it, and therefore transmits life to his activity. When we get home and tell our family about our work day or school day, we are, through narrative, giving visibility to our daily life and organizing the most important events so that we can later store them in our memory. The main function of gossip is not to speak ill of the lives of others. That's the motivation, for starters. The role is to develop a narrative full of dialogue and description that could be evil or ill-intended or malicious, but works very well when it's well narrated. And maybe the gossip can even become more perfect. And we have narratives that, of course, order thought, develop language, lead to other formulations of sentences, structuring, that is. In addition, they teach us how to tell a story, how to make cuts. All this can go far beyond those of the cinema cuts. A narrative does not cover everything, but rather highlights the core. And it doesn't even need to be linear. It's better if it's not. It's not out of chance that stories are told to the little ones before going to sleep. This is a millenary custom, an ancient habit initially established in meetings by the fire, where babies were lulled and children fell asleep. The calm rhythm of speech induces sleep, and narratives open up doors to dreams. We read the world by decoding what our observation collects and making links. As we read books, we decode books, we make connections between what we read, what we feel, our inner reality, and that surrounding us. Henceforth, whoever adds reading the world to reading books greatly expands the possibility of analysis, as well as transit between the present time and the past, and to position themselves critically within the social environment. However, unfortunately, reading the world seems to have lost relevance in large urban concentrations. We know what time the bus passes, we know those schedules, but we do not know the name of the tree that gives us shelter and shade while we wait for it. We do not touch the ground. We do not see the sprouts germinate. Everything is concrete, glass, and asphalt. I live on top of a very tall building, and I have the sea view from my terrace, but all those that visit me are surprised that I know anything about the winds and different weather conditions they bring about. It has become unnecessary to interpret the winds when every night you can watch the weather girl indicating what the temperature of the next day would be and announces rain or sunshine. Narratives also tend to get dehydrated in an increasingly fast-paced world. Modern buildings, for example, do not have windows at street level. And we no longer have window ladies. And I quote that statement, that always wait for a familiar passerby who would be ready to stop and hand over the map of other people's lives. Even children are being harmed. In France, I had the opportunity to hold a book that was in a corner with a discrete drawing of a clock and an indication of how many minutes it would take to read the book. Essential information for parents with many commitments or eager to see the next chapter of their favorite TV series. I would next like to have a minute, just a minute, given that our time's up, regarding modernity. Young people in their 20s look at their mobile phones anywhere between 150 and 190 times a day, and children, ages 3 to 5, spend on average 4 hours a day in front of cell phone screens, tablet screens, or computers. Marianne Wolf, a neuroscientist from the University of California, says in her book, The Brain in the Digital World, that when we read, the brain is activated both by empathy as well as the motor action of mirror neurons that interpret that empathy. But the computer, reading from our mobiles, and email manipulation are all disrupting this intricate process, thus decreasing our cognitive ability to deliver full text. Wolf says that if you cannot understand, remember, express ideas in writing, or you have no patience to read long, difficult books, that is a clear sign of contamination of the digital reading style on our brain activity. I would like to conclude this talk with a statement by that who knew everything about reading. Reading a lot is one of the ways to originality. A person is as original and peculiar as the knowledge of what others have said. The author of this statement is the Spanish philosopher and poet Miguel de Unamuno. We have a question. How much does the social context influence the creation of readers? Well, it has a major influence. In countries such as the case of Brazil, the difficulty to have a reading capability has been assessed. This is for children that have no proper economic conditions, that go to remote or very distant schools that are not well equipped, no available books, and they never see their children, their own parents reading. So the social context, as described, has a major influence, creating unfairness, leading to a separation between, well, because that is reflected on years later when entering the university or college years. In our country, diversity is very present in Brazil. Diversity is everywhere. And that is like a chain with an ironclad or an iron ball. It's a condemnation for all those that are poorest in the society, for the young children. The room, of course, plays a major role. Where we live plays a major role. Literacy of parents, the literacy level of the parents has an influence as well. So everything plays a role. Everything has an influence that is major. Well, Agustin, great question. Agustin Loera asks if women read more poetry, why there are more male poets? Well, because women used to sign their books with male names in the 19th century. They had to do so with male signatures. Otherwise, it would not be allowed for them to have poetry books. They were destined to have children and bear children and have a life and always breastfeed their children and stay home. We still have a great level of prejudice when it comes to feminine poetry. Biases out there. Women poets are decreasing in number, but thanks to Siborowna, a Polish name that I cannot remember, was awarded the Nobel Literature Prize, and that was great for all the women in the world. However, women poets have access to poetry nowadays, but under some oppression by critics that come from a male background. So it's a matter of defending the turf. It's territoriality that we're talking about here. Men won't open the doors to women. Now, for children, young adults, to like poetry, they need to read. I worked on 5 poetry books so that they could be lured to poetry. What has it meant for you to live right next to a poet? Well, I don't live with a poet, I live with a husband. He is the father to my daughters. He is my partner, my significant another. And this has meant that for a long time I was not part of the poetry world. I was somehow feared of hearing comments that I was emulating or trying to copy my husband's poetry. However, both his influence and mine are totally different. I am European, or I have an European background, and he's totally Brazilian, so our influences and backgrounds are different somehow. However, we were the first readers of the other. He read me, I read him, and the first reader of any work is entitled to make any corrections or comments. So after reading for a while, we would sit down on a couch, on a sofa, and either he or myself would read and make observations indicating what had to be changed, or whenever we found any type of error or mistake or recommendations, tips. I would recommend you to do this and that. This was an activity that is worth the time. It's priceless to have had those type of encounters. Last question, orality. Is it a good way to get children closer to reading? Orality plays a role when attracting children to reading? Yes, without any doubt. I have a screenwriter friend. When his wife was pregnant, he started to tell stories on the belly, on her belly. And he kept on doing that once the baby was born. This is a baby girl that was born. And whenever the girl was angry or mad, she didn't want to have her meals or she didn't want to take a bath, it would suffice for her to listen to her dad reading a story, and that baby girl turned out to be an excellent reader over time. So, when we talk about children getting closer to reading, is well, we have Yolanda Reyes, a Colombian author that has a baby tech. It's not an adult's library. It's a library for babies. We call it baby teca. And she came to Brazil and she gave a conference, and there was the swallowable or munchable books. That's the way they call it. I would like to thank from the bottom of my heart the International Book Fair in Guadalajara. I love the feel. I love the city of Guadalajara. And we are in the hands of reading promoters so that they can lead the way for young people to follow. All those that are so interested in reading fragmented pieces, not complete content, reading from the mobile, the cell phone, and attracting them to reading actual books and sitting down to read poetry. Poetry is the philosophy of life, and novels, as we said before, teach how to live. I count on you. Great job. A great job, please. Thank you.